Good evening, dear listener. As you settle beneath your blankets and let the day slip quietly into the background, allow me to take you back to a time long ago, a time of wind-blown fields, low thatched roofs, and hearths glowing like gentle hearts in the darkness. This is the story of how medieval farmers, humble folk of the land, endured the bitterest winters, and how, in doing so, they showed us the quiet strength of a simpler life. The air held its breath. It was late autumn in the village of Elderwin, and the fields that once rippled with wheat now lay bare and quiet, like a sleeping beast beneath a woolen sky. The last of the golden leaves clung stubbornly to the trees, fluttering like candlelight against the coming hush. Even the birds had quieted. Only the wind spoke now, whispering through hedges and under doors, as if passing along secrets from the north. In a small cottage on the edge of the village, just beyond the blackberry hedgerow, the Elmsworth family stood at their doorway and felt the season turn. Thomas Elmsworth, tall and broad-shouldered, with a beard the color of morning ash, tightened his cloak and squinted at the horizon. He smelled it in the wind, cold iron, distant snow. The first frost was coming. Maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow, but it was near. Behind him, Ellen stepped outside, her hands wrapped in a linen scarf she had stitched from scraps during last year's frost. Her fingers, nimble and calloused, brushed a strand of hair from her cheek as she too gazed at the sky. Pale gray, like a winter-blown feather, the light had changed. Their daughter, Aelith, 12 years old and growing like a sapling, bounced lightly on her toes, exhaling to see her breath. "It's smoke from my mouth," she giggled. And little Ben, barely 5, looked up at her with wide eyes. "Is that magic?" Thomas chuckled, his voice low and warm, like the crackle of kindling just beginning to catch. "No magic, lad, just the breath meeting the air. But it does feel magical, doesn't it?" The family stood in silence for a moment longer, not quite ready to go back inside. There was something sacred about that first breath of cold, the way it wrapped around the skin, the way it made the world quiet and close. It was a moment they knew well, a signal, a warning, a promise. Frost was the great guest of the season, and the house must be ready to welcome it. Inside the cottage, the Elmsworth home was a simple timber-framed dwelling, its walls wattle and daub, its roof low and thatched, sloping like a weary brow over the small windows. Inside, everything smelled of wood smoke, lavender, dried herbs, and the faint sweetness of old apples. The hearth was the heart of the home, a stone-lined fireplace that had burned steadily since the last snow melted in March. There were always coals beneath the ash, kept alive by careful tending. In the evenings, the family would gather there, their feet tucked beneath woolen skirts and blankets, faces lit by flickering light. This was the room where stories were told and bread was broken, where sewing was done by candlelight, where quiet songs were hummed while peeling potatoes or washing Ben's small hands. And now it would once again become their fortress against the cold. Thomas moved first. He went to the back room and brought in the first stack of firewood, thick pieces of oak and birch that had been drying since midsummer. He placed them carefully near the hearth, each log like a small piece of the sun stored for darker days. Ellen went to the pantry, taking stock of their stores. There were jars of honey, root vegetables in earthen bins, dried beans, apples strung up in bunches, and salted meats wrapped in cloth. She smiled softly. "We've done well," she murmured. Aelith set to checking the windows, stuffing the corners with strips of old linen and tufts of wool to block the wind. She took pride in her work, mimicking the motions her mother had taught her. Every little task felt like a spell, something to keep the cold away. Ben followed her, dragging a woolen toy sheep, his constant companion. "Will it snow tomorrow, Aelith?" he asked. "Maybe," she replied, "but don't be afraid, we're ready now." A village holding its breath. Outside, the village of Elderwin moved slowly. Farmers carried the last of their tools into barns. Shepherds led their flocks to lower pastures. In the square, old women bundled in layers of shawls traded root vegetables and stories in equal measure. Father Arlo, the village priest, rang the bell beside the chapel, not for service, but as a tradition. 3 soft chimes at dusk when frost was near, a reminder that the season had turned and the soul, like the soil, must be tended carefully. Children ran in woolen cloaks, their cheeks red, their laughter crisp. Dogs barked and then shivered, curling into straw beds. Chickens roosted early. Even the crows fell quiet. The frost was not feared, but it was respected. It was a visitor that could bless or burden, depending on how it was welcomed. That night, the fire burned brighter that evening, not because the room was colder, but because it felt right. More light, more warmth. As if to say to the frost, "Come if you must, we are not afraid." Thomas sat near the hearth, carving a small wooden spoon for Ben. He had once been a soldier, long ago, but now his hands made only tools and toys. Aleph combed wool for spinning. Ellen stitched the patch of a tunic that had worn thin at the elbows. Ben lay in a bundle of blankets, tracing shadows on the wall with his fingers. "Tell us a story, Da," he said sleepily. Thomas looked up and smiled. "A story, eh? What kind?" "A winter one." Ellen set down her needle. "Tell him the one about the frost fox." Thomas nodded. "Ah, the frost fox, that sly silver creature. All right then, the frost fox. Long ago," Thomas began, "there was a fox made entirely of frost and snow. Its eyes were like ice crystals, and its tail shimmered with moonlight. It came only when the nights grew long and the stars were sharp. But this fox did not hunt hens or chase mice. No, the frost fox wandered from cottage to cottage, peering into windows, looking for kindness. If it found a family that shared their fire, who kept each other warm with stories and songs, the fox would leave a gift. Maybe an extra bundle of kindling, or a rabbit caught in the night, or just a lighter wind the next day. But if it found cold hearts and cold hands, if the hearth was empty and no one shared their bread, the fox would leave silence and frost thick as stone." Ben's eyes were wide now. "Will it come here?" Thomas leaned close and whispered, "It already has, and it liked what it saw." Ben smiled and fell asleep not long after, his fingers still curled in the shape of a fox's tail. Just before dawn. Somewhere between night and morning, the world held still. The moon dipped low behind the hills, and the stars blinked one by one into sleep. And then, like a breath on glass, it came. Frost. It crept gently, not with ice storms or howling winds, but with grace. It touched the rooftops and the fences, kissed the fields, and curled itself around every leaf and blade of grass. It painted the world in white lace, delicate, silent, complete. Inside the cottage, the fire still glowed. The family slept close together, warmth shared not just through heat, but through the slow rhythm of breathing, the peace of trust, and the softness of love. No one heard the frost fox pass that night, but if they had, they might have noticed the faintest prints in the snow outside, and perhaps, just perhaps, a soft glimmer left behind, a whisper of winter's blessing. The frost had come, and now the real work began. It was one thing to watch winter's silver hand paint the rooftops, quite another to face its slow, steady tightening over every part of life. In Elderwin, the villagers knew well that frost was only the first guest of a long season. Snow, hunger, illness, loneliness, they often followed close behind. But the Elmsworths were ready, or rather, they were becoming ready. For readiness in a medieval winter was not a moment. It was a rhythm, a ritual, a series of small daily actions repeated with love, care, and deep ancestral knowledge. A morning in frost. The morning after the frost, Thomas Elmsworth rose early, even before the rooster's song. The air inside the cottage was still warm from the night's fire, but just barely. He moved slowly, careful not to wake the others, and slipped outside. His boots crunched softly against the frost-hardened earth. The chickens huddled in their coop, feathers puffed like cloaks. He whispered to them, "Not yet, girls, not yet," as he checked their feed and added extra straw. Back inside, Ellen stirred from sleep. She did not ask where Thomas had gone. She knew. She, too, had her own winter duties. She slipped on her shawl, woolen and worn, and set about warming yesterday's porridge. It had stiffened into a shape overnight, but it would soften with a bit of milk and a whisper of honey. She added a pinch of salt, murmuring to herself, "Warm the body, not just the belly." Aelith awoke next. She was already thinking ahead, about sealing the windows tighter, checking for leaks near the door, and whether the sheep's wool was ready to spin. She no longer needed reminding. Her hands had become swift, purposeful. Ben was last to wake, blinking up at the rafters with sleepy wonder. "Is the frost still here?" he asked. Ellen smiled as she handed him a warm cup. "It is, little bear, and it'll be with us for some time now." Wool and thread. That afternoon, the women sat by the window where the sun still touched the floorboards. Winter sun was precious, pale and low, but bright enough to work by. Ellen took out the mending basket. Socks, cloaks, undergarments, everything would need patching or reinforcing. She had once learned to sew with thread made from nettle fibers during a poor winter, but this year they had enough spun wool and flax cord to last the season. Aelith brought out a bundle of raw fleece. She picked gently through it, removing bits of straw and burrs. Then came the combing, a slow, meditative task. 2 wooden paddles, covered with tiny iron teeth, brushed the fibers until they lay flat like ribbons of cloud. "You're getting fast," Ellen noted, her voice soft with pride. Aelith smiled. "My hands remember more each year." "That's how we survive," Ellen said. "We remember, we teach, we pass it along." At the hearth, Ben sat with a wooden hoop and a small piece of linen. He wasn't old enough to spin, but Ellen had shown him how to pull colorful thread through cloth, forming wobbly little stars. "What are you sewing, Ben?" Aelith asked. He held up the cloth. "This is the frost fox. See its tail?" Ellen leaned over. "That's a fine tail, lad. Looks just like the real one." Ben beamed. Gathering herbs and roots. Outside, the village was a patchwork of slow motion. Everyone was busy, but no one rushed. There was no point in hurrying in winter. One could not outrun the cold. Thomas walked the edge of the woods with an old wicker basket on his back. He gathered kindling first, twigs from fallen branches, birch bark, dry moss, all good for starting fires quickly. Then he moved to the root patches. There, beneath the soil, slept the last of the wild carrots, burdock, and parsnip. With care, he dug them up, brushing off the dirt and wrapping them in cloth to keep them from freezing before reaching home. On the way back, he stopped by the home of old Marna, the village herbalist. Her doorway was framed with bundles of dried thyme, sage, and yarrow. The smell was strong, but comforting. "You've come for your winter pouch?" she said before he even knocked. Thomas nodded. "Aye, Ellen asked for one with willow bark and elderflower." "She's wise, that one," Marna muttered. "Winter's no friend to the lungs." She handed him a bundle of cloth filled with herbs. Inside were dried rose hips, slices of ginger root, and a tiny vial of thick, dark honey. "For the boy," she said, referring to Ben. Thomas pressed a small pouch of grain into her hand. "No charge," she said gruffly, "but I won't say no to a good loaf if Ellen's baking." Mending more than cloth. That evening, Ellen did bake. 2 loaves of barley bread, thick and heavy, with bits of dried apple folded into the dough. The scent filled the cottage, reaching even the corners where cold sometimes tried to creep in. Thomas came in with red cheeks and smoke on his cloak. "The barn roof is holding," he said, "but we'll need to repack the corners." Ellen handed him a cup of warm cider. "One thing at a time, love." As the light faded, they all gathered around the fire. The room glowed with quiet comfort. Alith spun a few lengths of thread, her fingers moving with a rhythm older than speech. Ben dozed, a half-eaten piece of bread still in his hand. Thomas leaned back and closed his eyes. "We're almost there." Ellen nodded. "One more week of preparation, maybe 2. Then let the snow fall as it may." In the village. All across Elderwin, similar scenes played out. Old Tom at the mill was reinforcing his door with planks. Widow Hazel was pickling the last of her cabbages. The blacksmith, Merrick, oiled every hinge and nail in his forge to keep the cold from seizing them shut. At the chapel, Father Arlo lit an extra candle in the window each evening. "For the lonely," he said, "so they know the village still sees them." Children helped where they could. Some gathered pine cones for kindling. Others helped chase chickens into warmer coops. Even the youngest had jobs, singing to the goats, polishing lanterns, fetching wool scraps. The frost was not a storm, it was a season. And a season was survived not in panic, but in preparation. The first snow. One morning, without warning, snow came. Not with wind, not with thunder, but with silence. Thomas opened the door and stood for a long moment, just looking. The world was white. The hedges, the roofs, the lanes, all smoothed by a fine, even layer of snow. Each flake had settled like it knew where to land. He turned and smiled at his family. "It's here." Alith ran to the window, eyes wide with wonder. Ben squealed and asked if the frost fox had come back to play. Ellen only nodded and said softly, "Then we've done well." They had warmth, they had food, they had each other, and they had prepared not only their home, but their hearts. The day began quietly, as winter days often do, still, pale, and expectant. In Elderwin, the sun rose like a tired traveler behind thick veils of cloud. Its light drifted gently across the rooftops and tree branches, barely strong enough to cast shadows. And yet, something in the air felt different, colder. Inside the Elmsworth cottage, Alith was the first to notice. She stood by the window with a steaming cup in her hands and watched as the frost on the glass thickened before her eyes. "Ma," she said softly, not turning around, "the sky looks heavy." Ellen approached, wrapping her arms around her daughter's shoulders. Together, they watched the clouds roll low and slow across the horizon, like wool dyed in storm gray. "It's coming," Ellen murmured, and she was right. By nightfall, the temperature would drop lower than it had in years. Signs and whispers. In medieval life, the cold had many voices, some obvious, others subtle. That morning, the chickens refused to leave their coop. The well water had frozen at the top, and Thomas had to break the crust of ice with the iron ladle. Smoke from the chimneys rose straight upward, slow and unbroken, like frozen ribbons. Even the trees were silent. No creak of limbs in the wind, no bird song. Only the soft thump of Thomas's boots in the snow as he returned from the woods, arms full of kindling, breath forming clouds that stayed in the air too long. Inside the cottage, Ellen placed her hand on the stone wall and felt its chill creep deeper than usual. She turned to her children. "We need more blankets today." They all moved like clockwork. Alith bringing out extra quilts from the chest, Ellen hanging thick curtains over the doors, Thomas sealing the hearth with new bricks of peat and wood ash. Every motion was familiar, practiced. Ben, too young to understand the science of winter, seemed to feel its weight. He stayed close to his sister all morning, clutching his woolen fox doll and peeking at the window. The talk in the village. Word spread quietly through Elderwin. At the chapel, Father Arlo placed 2 extra logs on the fire and whispered a prayer for the elderly and the sick. At the smithy, Merrick pounded the iron slower than usual, each strike echoing like a heartbeat across the snow-covered square. "Coldest night in a decade," he told anyone who passed. Old Marna, the healer, packed bundles of dried elderberry and yarrow in cloth, handing them to mothers and grandmothers with knowing looks. "Keep the hearth hot and the feet warmer," she said. "It's a night that likes to steal toes and breath." No one laughed. They all knew the truth. Winter in Elderwin was not cruel by nature, but it did not forgive the unprepared. Preparations deepen. That afternoon, the Elmsworths worked in silence. The sky had turned the color of pewter, and a cold wind now crept beneath the cottage eaves. Alith lit every candle, one by one, placing them in clay holders along the walls. Ellen simmered a pot of vegetable broth with dried garlic and thyme. "This will warm our bellies from the inside out," she told Ben, who watched eagerly as steam curled into the room like mist. Thomas took one last trip outside, trudging through snow up to his knees to fetch the final logs from the shed. When he returned, his beard was glazed with frost. "They say the fox was seen near the mill," he whispered to Ellen, pulling off his boots. She looked at him. "Truly?" Thomas nodded. 3 sets of tracks, too small for wolves, too fresh for morning. Ellen's eyes softened. "Then perhaps we will be blessed tonight." Nightfall. The sun slipped away quietly, and with it, warmth fled the land. Inside the Elmsworth home, the family layered wool upon wool, wrapped themselves in sheepskin and thick linen. The hearth blazed brighter than ever, orange, gold, and deep red flickers dancing along the wooden beams above. Ellen placed small pots of warm water beneath the beds, and Alith hung sprigs of rosemary near the windows to guard the breath, as old Marna had taught her. They ate their broth slowly, savoring each spoonful, letting the warmth spread from mouth to chest to fingers. Outside, the world had turned to crystal. The snow crunched like glass. The wind howled, not loud, but sharp, as if it carried tiny needles in its song. Even the moon seemed cold, a pale eye behind drifting clouds. Stories by the fire. As the wind rose, the family gathered close. Ben curled up beside his mother, half asleep, his cheeks rosy with heat and dreams. Alith leaned against her father, who was carving another shape into wood, this time a tiny owl. "Will you tell us something, Da?" Alith asked. Thomas nodded. "Tonight, a story about the coldest night ever known." Ben opened one eye. "Colder than this one?" "Much colder," Thomas said with a smile. The Tale of the Ice Queen's Kiss. Long ago, before villages like ours had walls or windows, there was a winter so deep that the stars froze in the sky. People whispered of the Ice Queen, a spirit who ruled the northern winds. She rode on a sleigh made of frozen moonlight, pulled by wolves made of snow and breath. When she passed, rivers froze solid and trees wept icicles. Now, the Ice Queen wasn't evil, just lonely. Each year, she came south to look for warm hearts to steal, hearts that could melt her own. But the people learned her secret. If a family shared their warmth, songs, laughter, firelight, the queen would pass them by. She could not steal joy. So on the coldest night, they lit every candle. They sang old songs. They shared bread and stories. And the queen, seeing all that light and love, would pause and smile and then disappear into the wind. Ben was asleep before the tale ended, his toy fox nestled in his arms. The cold deepens. Midnight came, and the frost deepened. The roof creaked with the weight of snow. Ice formed delicate ferns on the window panes. The fire flickered lower, and Thomas rose to add more wood. Each breath he took made the air shimmer. Aleph, half awake, whispered, "Is it the coldest now?" Ellen gently pulled the blanket over her. Almost. In the stillness, they listened, to the wind, to the pop of wood in the hearth, to the beating of their own hearts. And then a sound unlike the others. Soft footsteps in snow. Slow, deliberate. Thomas stood still, hand resting on the edge of the windowsill. Outside, in the moonlight, a silver shape moved across the white field, low, graceful, and silent. A fox. Its fur shimmered like frost, its eyes glowing like stars. It paused at the cottage, turning its head as if listening. Then, without sound, it continued into the woods, vanishing behind the trees. Aleph saw it too. She did not speak, only smiled, then pulled the blanket tighter and let sleep take her. Dawn breaks. The coldest night passed not with a bang, but with a sigh. As dawn broke, a faint golden light spilled over the horizon, touching the snow with warmth. The ice began to soften at the edges. A single bird chirped. Inside, the Elmsworths began to stir. Ben was the first to rise, warm and well rested. "Ellen," Thomas whispered, "look." He pointed to the edge of the hearth, where a strange mark had appeared. Small paw prints in soot, no bigger than a child's thumb, leading toward the door. They hadn't been there the night before. No one spoke. They didn't need to. There are times in winter when even the fire seems unsure of its flame, when silence is too deep, too still, like the world is waiting for something it doesn't want to come. And so it was in Elderwin, 3 days after the coldest night. The sun had returned, but only in appearance. Its warmth could no longer touch the frost beneath the trees. The snow outside the Elmsworth cottage was thick, packed down like old wool. And though the sky was pale blue, something unseen drifted on the air, an invisible weight pressing on the lungs. Illness had come. Not with drama, not with warning, just a cough, and then another. The first cough. It began with Ben. A soft sound in the night, barely more than a breath interrupted. Ellen rose to check on him, thinking he'd shifted in his sleep. She tucked the blanket higher, kissed his forehead, and found it a little warmer than usual. "Too many quilts, perhaps," she whispered. But the next morning, his cheeks were too flushed, and the light in his eyes had dulled. He coughed again, deeper this time, and didn't touch his porridge. Ellen placed her hand on his chest, and her brow furrowed. "His lungs are tight," she said softly to Thomas. They exchanged no more words. He rose, wrapped himself in his thickest cloak, and left for Marna the healer before the sun had fully risen. Marna's visit. Marna came by mid-morning, wrapped in furs, her basket clanking with glass vials and cloth pouches. Her face, lined with years and frost, was unreadable as she knelt beside Ben's bed. She listened to his breathing, counted his pulse,
pressed herbs beneath his tongue. When she finished, she sat back and placed a hand on Ellen's arm. "It's the chest-deep kind," she said. "But we've caught it early." She handed over a cloth bundle. "Steam this 3 times a day, thyme, pine needle, and elderflower, and keep him warm. Even warmth from your own hands helps." Ellen nodded. "For the fever," Marna added, pulling out a tiny jar of dark honey mixed with willow bark, 1 spoon at dusk and dawn. Ben stirred and coughed again. His voice was weak. "The fox came too close." Marna's eyes met Ellen's. "He dreams already."
The care. The days that followed blurred together. Ellen did not sleep, not properly. She stayed by Ben's side, wiping his brow, holding his hand, humming songs that her mother once sang in the face of fever. Thomas kept the fire going. He rarely left the cottage now, only to fetch water or carry snow in pails to melt for washing. Alith took on everything else. She cooked the meals, fed the chickens, patched socks, and made warm compresses with herbs. Each night she read softly to her brother, tales of faraway forests, kind dragons, and skies where stars danced like fireflies. And still the cough lingered. At times it faded, then it returned. Ben would smile weakly and say, "It's leaving." But then by nightfall his fever would rise again, and the shadows under his eyes would darken. Outside the walls, the illness was not theirs alone. In the village, shutters remained closed longer each morning. Chimneys smoked all day. At the chapel, Father Arlo lit extra candles, not for light, but for prayer. Marna walked from home to home, her steps slow but constant, her basket always full and always nearly empty when she returned. She spoke little, but people trusted her silence. Elderwin had seen this before. Illness was part of winter, as natural as snow and twice as feared. Some recovered, others did not. The memory of fire. One evening, Ellen sat by the hearth with Ben on her lap. His breathing was slow but steady. She wrapped his fingers in hers and whispered, "When you were born, it snowed. Do you remember?" He shook his head faintly. "We were poor that winter. The fire was so small. But when I held you, you were warm, like a coal tucked in my arms." Ben smiled a little. "That's how I knew you'd be strong, because you brought fire with you." He closed his eyes, murmuring, "I still have it. It's in my chest." "Yes," she said, "that's your job now. Keep that fire burning."
The night of smoke. That night, the fire nearly died. A gust of wind slipped down the chimney and sent a spray of ash into the room. The flame shrank. A log cracked sharply and rolled. Thomas rose quickly, stoked the coals, added more wood. The flames rose again, slow but sure. Ben stirred. "Don't let it go out," he whispered. "We won't," Alith said gently. Outside, the snow fell again, thicker this time. The world seemed wrapped in silence. But inside, the fire spoke, and for a while, that was enough. A strange visitor. On the 4th night, as Ellen dozed in the rocking chair beside Ben's bed, a soft knock came at the door. It was late, too late for neighbors. Thomas opened it cautiously. There stood an old man, not from Elderwin. His beard was white, but his eyes were sharp, and he wore no cloak despite the snow. "I heard a child was ill," he said simply. Thomas said nothing, but Ellen stepped forward. "Who are you?" "Once a healer," the man said. "Long ago, I was passing through." Without waiting for permission, he stepped inside, crossed to the hearth and knelt before Ben. He placed his hands just above the boy's chest, not touching, only hovering, and whispered something no one understood. Ben slept on. When the man stood, he looked to Ellen. "He'll wake hungry tomorrow. Feed him well. The fever has turned." And then, without another word, he left, vanishing into the falling snow. Dawn and bread. The next morning, Ben opened his eyes with a sound Ellen hadn't heard in days. A laugh. Weak, yes, but real. "I dreamed of fire," he said, and someone whispered to it. Ellen touched his forehead. Cool. She nearly cried. Instead, she kissed him and went to bake. The smell of barley bread filled the home. Alith danced as she stirred porridge. Thomas stood outside, breathing deep, watching the chimney smoke rise straight into the blue morning sky. Ben ate, slowly, but he ate. His cough lingered, but his eyes were bright again. The quiet thanks. That evening, as stars appeared over Elderwin, the family sat by the fire once more. Ben nestled in Ellen's arms, warm and drowsy. They said nothing. Sometimes gratitude needs no words. Only the fire crackling. Only the snow falling. Only the breath of those you love, rising and falling, safe for another night.
Some nights speak loudly, with wind that howls and branches that cry. Others speak only in whispers, the kind of whispers that drift like mist across the snow. After Ben's fever broke, a hush fell over the Elmsworth home, not from worry, but from relief. The kind of quiet that settles in only after the storm has passed. It was the heart of winter now, the days short and pale, the nights long and silver. And in that silence, something began to stir. Not danger, but memory. Not fear, but mystery. The snowfall deepens. The snows returned 2 days after Ben's recovery, gentle at first, then steady, blanketing Elderwin in a thick layer of silence. The village slowed, paths became narrow, the forest disappeared beneath a sea of white. Children no longer played outside. The well was harder to reach. Smoke from chimneys twisted into the sky like wandering spirits. But within the Elmsworth cottage, warmth held. Ben sat beside the hearth now, pale but smiling. Alith read to him from old folk tales, her voice rising and falling like soft wind through pine trees. Ellen ground herbs in the mortar, her movements slow and rhythmic. Thomas carved quietly by the window, shaping a small horse from oak. The snow, thick as wool, muffled the outside world. And in that muffled quiet, the family began to notice something strange. Whispers. The first whisper. It was Alith who heard it first. She had stepped outside at dusk to shake out the bedding, a daily ritual. The snow beneath her boots barely crunched, so soft was the new layer. The air was utterly still. And then, so faint it might have been the wind, she heard it. A voice, not calling her name, not speaking words, just a gentle sound, like a story being told in another room, a language older than her own. She stood there, motionless, breath clouding the air. The whisper came again, not frightening, just strange, familiar in the way dreams sometimes are. When she returned inside, her cheeks red with cold, she said nothing, only glanced back at the door once before helping Ellen with supper. Alith's dream. That night, Alith dreamed of snow falling inside the house. It floated gently through the beams, drifting down over the hearth, the table, the beds. But the snow did not melt. It shimmered like tiny stars. In her dream, someone stood in the corner of the room.
Tall, cloaked in white, face hidden. A presence, not dark, not cruel, but ancient, watching. When she woke, the fire had nearly gone out. She didn't tell anyone about the dream, but from that night on, she paid closer attention to the silence. Stories from the old days. The next day, Aelith asked her mother, "Have you ever heard whispers in the snow?" Ellen paused, wiping flour from her hands. She glanced at Thomas, who sat nearby threading a fishing line. "I have," she said at last. Aelith blinked. "You have?" Ellen nodded slowly. "I was a girl, younger than you. There was a winter like this, very still, very deep. I went into the woods to gather pine cones for the hearth, and I heard singing, not words, just sound, a melody that didn't belong to anything I knew." Thomas added quietly, "There are stories, old ones, about the snow spirits, voices that travel the wind when the world sleeps." "Do you believe them?" Aelith asked. "I believe that not everything is meant to be understood," Ellen replied, "but some things are meant to be heard. The tracks." The next morning, Aelith rose early. She wanted to follow the silence. Wrapped in furs, she stepped outside just as the sun touched the edge of the horizon. The snow glittered faintly, untouched. But near the tree line, she saw something unusual. Tracks. They were not deer, not wolf. Small, almost human, but barefoot. She followed them carefully, only a few steps before they disappeared into a soft drift of snow, as if whoever had made them had simply vanished. When she turned to head back, she heard it again. The whisper. Clearer this time. Just a note, a breath, a sigh. She whispered back, unsure why. Not words, just a breath in return. The wind picked up, and then she heard something impossible. Laughter. Soft, gentle, like a child hiding behind a tree. The Healer's Tale. That afternoon, Aelith visited Marna to fetch more cough root for Ben. The old woman was grinding dried yarrow when Aelith arrived, her small cottage glowing with the scent of cedar and tallow. As Aelith waited, she asked, "Marna, do you believe in snow spirits?" Marna didn't look up. "I believe the world is full of things that don't need belief to exist." "Have you ever heard them?" Aelith pressed. Now Marna paused. "When I was about your age," she said, "I got lost in a storm. I wandered too far from my mother's herb path. Couldn't see a thing, just white. Everything was white." She set down her pestle and looked at Aelith. "I sat in the snow and cried. And then I heard it, a voice, not loud, not sharp, just warm. It said my name, nothing else. I followed it, found my way back to the path." "Was it real?" Aelith asked. Marna smiled. "What is real, child? The snow is real, and so are the things it remembers." The Telling Night. That evening, Aelith told her family everything. The whispers, the tracks, the laughter. She expected skepticism, but instead, Thomas simply said, "Some winters, the veil is thin." Ellen nodded. "They do not visit everyone, just those who still listen." "Who are they?" Aelith whispered. No one answered right away. Then Ben, sitting quietly by the fire, said softly, "Maybe they're the ones who remember, the ones who came before." Everyone looked at him. "Maybe they whisper so we don't forget," he said. A story remembered. Later, as snow fell again and the night drew its veil over the village, Thomas began to speak. "This story was told to me by my grandmother," he said, "and she heard it from hers.
It is older than our walls, older than our roofs. They all leaned in. Long ago, when Elderwin was just stones and dreams, there lived a girl named Moira. She was kind, and she listened to the world, not just to people, but to birds, to trees, and to snow. One winter, the village grew ill. Food was scarce. Fires burned low. People stopped singing. They stopped laughing. Moira went into the woods each night and whispered her stories to the wind, hoping it would carry them somewhere warm. One night, the snow answered. It led her to a grove where a tree grew that had never lost its leaves. Beneath it was warmth, real warmth, and a spring that had not frozen. She carried water back to the village drop by drop, enough to heal the sick. But when spring came, she was gone. Some say the snow took her. Others say she became part of it. To this day, when the snow falls quietly and the wind carries old songs, they say Moira listens and sometimes answers. The whisper returns. That night, Aelith awoke to a whisper at the window. She rose, heart calm, and opened the shutters. There was no figure, no footprints, only snow. But in the silence, she heard it again. A breath, a wordless story, a memory carried on the wind. And she whispered back, "I remember you." There are nights when darkness is not just the absence of light, but something deeper, a presence, a veil, a quiet that swallows even thought. But all it takes to hold it back is a single candle, and sometimes even that is lost. A new moon. The new moon arrived without fanfare. No silver light upon the snow, no shadows dancing in the forest, only deep, velvety blackness pressing against every window of Elderwin like a heavy curtain drawn across the world. Within the Elmsworth cottage, the fire glowed low but steady. Aelith sat closest to it, turning a bit of wax in her hands, shaping it slowly with warm fingers. It would be a candle, her first, made by hand. Ellen watched her from across the room, spinning wool in silence. "Be patient with the wick," she murmured. "It will burn only if you shape it true." Aelith nodded. "I want it to last, through the whole night." Thomas added from near the door, "Then don't fear the dark. Candles remember strength, not fear." Ben coughed gently in his sleep, and the wind began to rise outside. The missing light. When the family settled for the night, Aelith placed the candle beside her bed. It wasn't perfect, crooked and small, but she was proud of it. She lit the wick with a sliver of pine, watching it flicker to life. A little glow, a little warmth, like a star that had wandered indoors to rest. But sometime after midnight, as the wind howled louder and the rafters creaked with frost, the candle went out. No breeze had touched it. No hand had dimmed it. It simply vanished. Aelith sat up. The darkness was thick, so thick she could barely see her own fingers. She reached out, found only air. She whispered, "Hello?" but her voice felt swallowed. And then, far off, she saw it. A tiny light. Not the candle, not fire. Something else. Something waiting. Into the snow. The cottage felt suddenly unfamiliar, like a dream she'd forgotten how to wake from. Drawn by the light, Aelith rose, pulled on her cloak, and stepped outside. The snow was soft beneath her boots, and the sky was ink black, not a star in sight. But the glow ahead, faint, golden, remained steady. She followed it, past the barn, beyond the well, into the trees. Each step felt like memory, each breath a question. And the deeper she went, the quieter the world became, as though time itself was holding its breath. The Keeper of Candles. In a small clearing surrounded by frost-kissed pines, Alith found the source of the light. It was not a lantern. It was a single candle set upon a stone, and beside it stood a figure, tall, wrapped in layers of fur and fabric that shimmered with frost. The face was hidden, but the voice was clear, soft and deep, like snow falling on old wood. "You came for what was lost." Alith didn't speak, only nodded. The figure gestured to the candle. "Do you know what it means to carry light?" "I thought I did," Alith whispered. "And now?" Alith stepped forward, eyes fixed on the flame. "Now I think it's more than fire. It's hope." The figure nodded. "A candle holds more than wax and wick. It holds memory. It holds love. It holds every hand that ever lit a fire to keep someone warm." A pause. "Yours burned with kindness. That is why it was chosen." "Chosen for what?" "To guide." A silent journey. The figure handed the candle to Alith. At first, she feared it would go out in her hands, but it didn't. It didn't. Its flame didn't flicker, didn't waver. It seemed to know her. "Where am I guiding?" she asked. The figure pointed beyond the trees, to one who forgot the way. Without another word, Alith turned and followed the path the candle lit. The snow glowed pale gold beneath her steps. Shadows slid gently away, making room. And then she saw him, a boy, no older than Ben, shivering beneath a pine, lost, face pale with fear. He looked up as she neared, eyes wide. "I can't see." "You don't have to," Alith said softly. "I can." She took his hand, and together they walked. The homeward path. It was a long walk back, but not lonely. Alith didn't speak much, nor did the boy. But their steps were steady. The candle never dimmed. The trees thinned. The wind softened. And before long, they reached the edge of the village. The boy's home was a tiny cottage near the river, its roof nearly swallowed by snow. A woman stood outside, calling his name into the night. When she saw them, her cry broke the silence. She rushed forward, wrapping the boy in her arms. Tears steamed against his cold cheeks. Alith watched for a moment, then turned. But the woman called to her. "Wait, what's your name?" Alith smiled. "I'm just someone who remembered the light." The flame returns. When Alith returned home, the horizon had begun to lighten. The door creaked softly as she entered. Inside, all was still. Her family slept. She placed the candle on the hearth, and it flickered once, then went out. But the warmth remained. And in that moment, Alith understood. The candle had never truly been lost. It had simply gone where it was needed most. A lesson in wax. Later that morning, as the sun painted silver across the window panes, Ellen found Alith in the corner, kneading wax again. "Making another?" she asked. Alith nodded. "This one will be stronger," she said, "and softer." "Why softer?" Ellen asked. Alith smiled. "Because kindness burns brighter than anything else." Epilogue. In the window. That night, they placed the new candle in the window. Its glow was gentle, warm. And though no one spoke of it, each of them glanced at it often. Because in Elderwin, when the world grows dark and the nights stretch long, sometimes the simplest light is the strongest reminder. You are not alone. Someone, somewhere, still carries the flame.
There are places in the world where words go quiet, where even the wind does not speak, not because there is nothing to say, but because everything worth saying is already known. The villagers of Elderwin called it simply the silent tree. They did not often visit it, but they always remembered it. The first mention. It was during breakfast, with snow curling gently outside, that Thomas brought it up. He'd been mending a pair of worn boots, the leather stiff from cold. Aelith stirred a pot of barley porridge, while Ellen wound a new skein of wool. "Do you remember the tree?" Thomas asked, not looking up. Ellen paused, her fingers halting mid-rap. Aelith tilted her head. "Which tree?" Thomas glanced out the window. "The tall one, beyond the northern fields, the one no birds sit on." "Oh," Ellen said softly. Ben looked up from his seat near the hearth. "Why don't birds sit there?" Thomas replied quietly, "Because it listens." A walk northward. That afternoon, drawn by something she couldn't name, Aelith asked her father to show her. They dressed warmly, layered in furs and wool, boots wrapped in flax against the deep snow. The sun, pale and low, painted the sky with a quiet gold. Their journey north took them past the grazing fields, now blanketed and empty, past the frozen creek, silent beneath a glassy crust, past the last of the pine stands where fox tracks traced along the edge. And then they saw it. Tall, bare, still. A tree unlike any other. The tree. It stood alone, not from rejection, but reverence. Its bark was pale and smooth, like riverstone, unbroken by knots or moss. No snow clung to its limbs, no ice weighed it down. Its branches stretched like arms mid-embrace, yet they moved not at all, even in the breeze. Thomas stopped several paces away. "We never go closer than this," he said. "Why?" Aelith asked, her breath misting in the air. "Because the tree remembers everything." She turned to him. "What does that mean?" He took a long pause. "There are things the land forgets, seasons, storms, even names. But some trees, they remember. They carry it in silence." The Elder's Tale. Back at home, Aelith visited Old Thorn, the village's oldest man. He lived alone in a small stone cottage with herbs hanging from every beam, and a cat who never made a sound. Thorn's voice rasped with age, but his mind was clear. "The silent tree?" he said when Aelith asked. "I sat beneath it once, long before you were born." "You did?" she asked, surprised. He nodded slowly. "I was a foolish boy, brave in the way youth always is. I wanted to prove that it was just a tree, nothing more. And what happened? I heard nothing, not a single sound, not my own breathing, not the trees around it, not the wind. It was as though time had forgotten to move." "Were you afraid?" "No," he said, his eyes distant. "I felt understood." The Orphan's Tale. That night, snow fell soundlessly. No wind, no creak of roof beams, no fire crackle, just stillness. Aelith lay in bed, her mind stirring like a winter stream beneath ice. If the tree remembered everything, did it remember her? Or her mother's laughter? Or the stories Thomas told at dusk? Or the first time Ben walked across the cottage floor? Could memories live in bark? Could love live in roots? As she drifted toward sleep, she dreamed of the tree, its branches full of voices, not speaking, just being, like the past itself, watching. A visit alone. The next day, with her parents distracted by a jammed chimney, Aelith bundled herself quietly and slipped away. She followed the northern trail again, alone this time, her footsteps soft as owl wings across the snow. When she reached the tree, she stopped just beyond where Thomas had. She waited and listened. Nothing. But not the kind of nothing that scares, the kind that holds you, like a hand without weight. She stepped closer, one pace, then another. The air grew thick, not cold, still, like honey poured into the sky. And then she heard something impossible, a memory, her own voice from years ago. "I'm not afraid of the dark," it said. She had spoken those words to Ben long ago when he was afraid of thunder. The tree had kept it. What it keeps. Alith sat in the snow. She stayed for a long time, not thinking, not worrying, only feeling. She began to sense what the tree held. A lullaby hummed by a mother who died too young. The sound of hooves from a long-forgotten cart. A boy's laugh that hadn't been heard in 50 winters. A promise once whispered into soil and now grown tall. She felt none of it in her ears, only in her chest, like warmth, like presence, like something that had never truly left. The return. When Alith finally stood, dusk had begun to gather. She turned to leave, but paused, pressing her mittened hand gently against the bark. "Thank you," she whispered. No reply came, but as she walked away, she felt lighter, not because she had left something behind, but because she was now carrying something with her. The family gathers. That night, as wind picked up and snow beat gently against the windows, Alith told her family everything. About the silence, about the memory of her voice, about how the tree did not speak, but listened. Thomas nodded solemnly. Ellen reached out and touched her daughter's hand. "I think," Ellen said, "that some places were never meant for words." The window and the tree. Before bed, Alith placed a candle in the window. As she lit it, she whispered softly to the night, "I remember too." And far to the north, beyond the frozen fields and the sleeping woods, the silent tree stood still, not answering, not echoing, just holding everything that ever was, and everything that still hoped to be. Some warmth is not made of fire. Some light is not born from flame. Sometimes what keeps us alive in the coldest nights is a single loaf of bread, waiting, uncut, untouched, because someone, somewhere, is still meant to come home. A promise of wheat. It began with flour. Just a handful, carefully sifted, saved from the last sack, mixed with melted snow and a bit of salt. Ellen stirred the dough slowly, her hands patient, her thoughts far. It was early morning, and the hearth fire had only just begun to wake. The others still slept, save Alith, who watched quietly from across the room, her breath visible in the cold. "Are we baking today?" she asked gently. Ellen nodded. "Just one loaf." "Is it for supper?" Ellen hesitated, then smiled faintly. "No, this one is for waiting." A story in every crust. As the dough rose, Ellen told the story. "Long ago," she began, "a woman had a son who went to war. She didn't know when he would return, or if he ever would. Each kneading of the dough came with rhythm, like memory. She baked a loaf every 7th day and left it on the windowsill, warm, fragrant, untouched." Alith tilted her head. "Why?" "Because if he returned, hungry, cold, or broken, he would find it, and know he had not been forgotten." A silence passed between them, filled only by the creak of the old wooden table. "Did he ever come home?" Aelith asked. Ellen pressed her hands flat over the dough. "No one remembers, but the bread always waited." The preparation. That afternoon, the cottage smelled like home. Not just of bread, but of comfort, of shared quiet, of time slow enough to be noticed. Ellen placed the loaf into the brick oven, nestled on a thick oak paddle. The fire glowed gently behind it, not rushed, just steady. Thomas, returning from splitting wood, paused at the door and smiled. "That smell brings back years." Ben wandered in, nose up. "Is that for me?" Ellen tousled his hair. "This one's special." "For Papa?" "No," she said, softer now. "For someone who's late." The window shelf. By twilight, the loaf was ready. Golden, whole, untouched by knife or hand. Ellen placed it on the narrow shelf just inside the window, where it would stay warm beside the frost glass pane. A small cloth covered it, stitched with blue thread, slightly worn but lovingly clean. Ben whispered, "Won't it get hard?" "It might," Ellen said. Aelith added, "But it will still be bread." "And more than bread," Ellen whispered. "It will be remembrance." A visitor in the wind. That night, wind howled across the thatched roofs of Elderwyn. Snow swept across the lanes like white rivers. And someone knocked on the door. Once, then again. Thomas rose, cautious but calm. When he opened it, the cold rushed in, and with it, a man, wrapped in a thick, battered cloak, face red with cold, boots worn smooth. He removed his hood slowly. A silence fell. Then Ellen gasped. Her hands flew to her mouth. Jonas, her brother, gone 12 winters to sea. A meal of reunion. Jonas sat by the fire, steaming cup in hand, his voice rough but grateful. "I didn't know if you still lived here," he said. Ellen couldn't speak. Her eyes brimmed. Aelith handed him a bowl of stew. Ben pressed close, curious and shy. Thomas brought down an old, dusty bottle of elderberry wine. And then Ellen reached for the loaf in the window. It was warm still, somehow. She placed it in Jonas's hands. He broke it gently, and the cottage, in that moment, felt more whole than ever before. The loaf that followed. In the days that followed, Jonas helped mend the roof, fix the fences, and play silly games with Ben that filled the house with laughter again. But one night, while the wind slept and stars peeked through the frost, he told Ellen, "I'll have to leave again, come spring." She nodded. "The sea doesn't rest." "No," he said, "but now I know where home is." She touched his arm. "We'll bake a loaf for you." And so it waits. From then on, every 7th day, a new loaf appeared on the window shelf. Sometimes it was thick with dried berries. Sometimes laced with wild honey. Sometimes simple, plain, and strong. But always, always, it waited. Not for Jonas alone, but for every traveler, every returner, every soul who wandered too far and needed to remember the taste of the longing. Aelith's turn. Years passed, and one day Ellen's hands grew too tired for kneading. So Aelith baked the waiting bread. And when Ben grew old enough, he helped shape it. And when children came to Elderwyn in springtime, hungry and tired, the bread found them. They didn't always understand the story, but they understood the warmth, and the wait, and the love. The bread that waits still. Today, if you pass through Elderwyn, perhaps just after snowfall, when chimney smoke curls against the sky, you might see it. A single loaf, sitting in the window of a quiet house. Not for sale, not for show, but for someone who is not yet home. And you will know, deep down, as all who pass through do, Some bread is not for eating. It is for remembering.
There are places where silence listens, where secrets do not echo but rest, where wishes are not shouted nor written, only breathed and forgotten. In Elderwin there was such a place, a well, old, round, quiet, and never dry. Aelith's discovery. It was Aelith who found it again one soft morning in late winter, when the frost clung gently to her shawl and the air smelled of old snow and thawing earth. She had wandered beyond the apple orchard, down the slope where forgotten trails meandered like sleeping thoughts. The ground was brittle under her feet, and branches above creaked in the hush of windless air. Then she saw it, a low circle of stone, half buried in moss and memory, the well. She stepped closer. No rope, no bucket, just depth and quiet. She leaned in and heard nothing, which was, in its own way, everything. The story her grandmother told. That evening by the hearth, she asked her grandmother, old Merwin, about the well. Merwin's eyes, clouded with age but sharp with wisdom, blinked slowly. "So you found it again," she murmured. "Again?" Aelith asked. "It finds a new girl every winter or two," Merwin said with a smile. "That's how it keeps from being forgotten." Aelith waited. Merwin looked into the fire. "That well has no name, but long ago, people went to it with wishes they couldn't speak aloud. Why? Because they were too soft for words, too sacred, or too sad." Aelith whispered. "And the well heard them?" Merwin nodded. "It heard, and it kept them." What cannot be said? The next day, Aelith returned. She didn't bring anything, no parchment, no coins, no ribbons, only herself, wrapped in a blue wool cloak and quiet thoughts. She knelt by the edge, closed her eyes, and thought, "I wish Ben would not grow up too fast." The thought slipped from her mind like a feather from a sleeve, and fell into the well. There was no splash, only stillness, only a kind of peace. The villagers who knew. Word spread quietly. First, Ellen visited. She stayed only a moment and left with tears in her eyes but a softness on her face. Then Thomas. He did not kneel, but stood beside the stones for a long time, one hand resting on the rim. When he turned to leave, he looked younger. Old Thorn came, sat for an hour, said nothing after. And then others. The baker's wife, who had lost a child. The shepherd boy, who feared he'd never be good enough. The potter's daughter, who wondered if anyone would truly see her. None of them spoke aloud, but the well remembered them. Wishes the wind forgot. In time, snow began to melt. Days stretched longer. Geese returned, and icicles wept their last tears. But still the well remained, not just of water, but of holding. It held. A grandfather's wish to live long enough to see the sea once more. A child's wish that the dog he lost last summer still dreamed of him. A widow's wish that she would forget how his laughter sounded so it would stop hurting. A boy's wish to be brave enough to say, "I'm sorry." Each wish slipped in without a sound. Each one found rest. Aelith's second visit. One cloudy dusk, Aelith returned again. This time she felt something deeper stirring. She knelt and breathed another thought into the stone circle. "I wish I knew how to let go of things that are already gone." She opened her eyes, surprised by her own honesty. The well said nothing, but the wind shifted, and she felt her shoulders relax. A well that waits. As the years passed, the well was never filled, never roofed, never marked by sign or name. Children found it and left berries. Lovers found it and left glances. Elders found it and left nothing but silence. And in every season it listened, not to voices, but to hearts. The final wish. One winter many years later, Marwyn came with Aelith, now grown, and Ben, now taller than the doorframe. They stood in quiet, the three of them, snow around their boots. Marwyn leaned close. "This may be my last winter," she said, not sadly, just true. Aelith swallowed. Ben took her hand. Marwyn stepped forward, closed her eyes, and breathed her last wish into the well. They never knew what it was, but when they left, hand in hand, the sun broke briefly through the clouds, and for a moment, even the snowflakes paused. The water beneath. They say the well never runs dry, not because of rain, not because of underground springs, but because the wishes that fall into it become part of the water, each one light as breath, each one waiting, not to be granted, not to be answered, but simply to be held. And sometimes that is all we need.
Some warmth survives fire, some comfort survives sorrow, and some blankets are never truly made of wool alone. The fire at the edge of Elderwin. It happened one winter dusk when the wind turned cruel and the sky turned brass. A spark leapt from a chimney and landed in the straw-laced roof of old barn Caelin's cottage. No one saw the fire begin, but all of Elderwin saw it burn. The flames danced high and wild, fierce as wolves, devouring wood and thatch as though winter had finally decided it would no longer wait. Ellen screamed for help. Ben ran with buckets. Thomas shouted instructions. Even Aelith, still winded from gathering pine cones, helped form a chain to the well. But the roof collapsed before they could save it. A quiet heap of ash. When morning came, all that remained was a hush, a silence so deep it pressed on the chest. The barn was gone, the sidewall of the cottage gone with it. The old shelves, the cradle, the small wood table Caelin had carved for his daughter, they were ash now. And Caelin himself sat in the snow beside what had once been his world, holding something in his arms, wrapped in soot, frayed at the edges, but whole, a blanket, old, stitched in many colors, still warm. The story beneath the stitching. Ellen approached carefully, crouching beside Caelin. "That's the blanket, isn't it?" she whispered. Caelin nodded. "The one my mother made when I was a boy. She said it had bones." Ellen blinked. "Bones?" He smiled faintly, meaning it would outlive everything soft. The edges were singed, but the center glowed like the inside of an ember. Red, brown, threads of forest green. A pattern that had no pattern, just color after color, year after year. "It's the only thing that didn't burn," he said. A blanket of generations. In the days that followed, the villagers took turns hosting Caelin in their homes, offering bowls of stew, stories by the hearth, and quiet comfort. But the blanket traveled with him, folded carefully, draped over shoulders, laid beside pillows, held in laps. Ben asked once, "Why do you keep it with you all the time?" Caelin looked down at the threads. "It's the only thing left that's known all of me, all the versions of me I've been." The memory within the wool. Each patch held something. The red square from his mother's skirt when she danced in the village green. The gray patch from his father's old coat worn through at the elbows. The blue triangle from the apron his wife had sewn before she passed. The green strip his daughter had chosen when she turned 10, stitched crooked but bright. It was not a blanket. It was a tapestry of people, of days, of losses and returns, and it had survived flame. The night of bitter cold. A month later, a storm rolled in, sharp and sudden. Snow thickened the air and the firewood ran low. That night, the youngest child in Elderwin, baby Ilsa, caught fever. Her breaths were shallow, her skin cold. Ellen paced the room, desperate. "Let her rest," said the herbalist, "but keep her warm." But the fire had dimmed, and the furs were not enough. Then Callan stepped forward, blanket in hand. "Use this," he said. Ellen shook her head. "It's all you have left." He smiled. "It's never been just mine."
Wrapped in remembering. Ilsa slept that night in the warmth of the indestructible blanket, and her fever broke by morning. The old herbalist said it was the tea. The midwife said it was luck. But Ben whispered to Alith, "I think it was the blanket. It remembers how to comfort. What fire cannot take." They began calling it the hearth blanket. Whenever someone was ill or grieving or alone, it came to them, folded neatly, left at the doorstep, always returned quietly after. And each time someone would add a stitch, a yellow thread for a grandmother's smile, a strip of worn shirt from a boy who left for the city, a knot tied in the corner for a secret hope not yet spoken aloud. Callan never minded. "It gets stronger with every sorrow," he said, "and every kindness." One final winter. Years passed. Callan grew slower, and one soft winter morning he did not rise. They found him in his bed, eyes closed, a faint smile on his lips. The blanket pulled to his chin. It was warm to the touch. Even the fire in the hearth had gone out. But the blanket glowed. The blanket that could not burn. They could not bury it. It was not right. Instead, they left it folded in the meeting house, beside the fire, under a sign that simply read, "For those who carry quiet sorrow." And still it moves, from hand to hand, from loss to healing, from end to beginning. The threads continue. One day, Alith sat by the fire, blanket in her lap, teaching a young girl how to thread a needle. "What color will you ask?" Alith asked. The girl thought, then chose a soft violet. "For my brother," she whispered. "He never met our father, but I want him to feel like he has something that knows us." Alith smiled, and together they stitched. The warmth that stays. If you pass through Elderwin on a winter night and find yourself cold, truly cold, in a place deeper than skin, you may find the blanket waiting for you. No one will ask your sorrow. No one will need your story. Just wrap it around yourself and listen to all the love that never left, to all the fire that could not destroy, to a warmth that was never truly wool at all. There are moments when sound fades, when even bells, mighty, proud, ever-ringing bells, fall quiet, not because something is wrong, but because silence is needed more. When the bell rope broke. The great bell of Elderwin had hung in the chapel tower for generations. Thick bronze, dulled with age, it rang for weddings, for mourning, for feasts and snow warnings alike. But one morning, just before the frost moon, the rope gave way. With a snap and a tumble of dust, the heavy clapper stilled. The bell did not ring that day, nor the next. The village without sound. At first, the silence felt strange. Children ran through the square wondering if time had stopped. Ellen looked up from her stall every hour, half expecting the chime that told her when to knead the bread. Thomas tapped his foot impatiently, as if waiting for a signal that would never come. Even Alith found herself pausing at noon,
unsure if she'd missed something. But slowly, something else crept in. A quiet that felt restful, like a deep breath after a long walk. What the silence allowed. Without the bells, people began to listen differently. To the wind shifting snow on rooftops, to the sound of sheep chewing cud by moonlight, to the way fire cracked when it caught on birch, to one another. Conversations grew longer. Pauses were not filled with nervous words. Even arguments softened, spaced by thoughtful stillness.
The children's new game. Children started a new game called Still Bells. They'd sit in a circle, eyes closed, trying to name every sound they could hear. Bird wings, snow falling off a branch, someone humming across the river, grandfather's breath. They giggled, not out of boredom, but delight. One day, Ben sat with them. At the end, he whispered, "I heard my mother's laugh in my own voice." Repairing without rushing. The bell could have been fixed in a day, but it wasn't. No one rushed, not out of laziness, but respect. They wanted the silence to linger, so Thomas cleaned the bell slowly. Marin's grandson twisted a new rope over 3 evenings. The vicar polished the bell's edge with beeswax, humming lullabies the whole time. It was a slow reverence, a repair made with gentleness. When the bell rang again. 3 weeks later, they rang the bell again, just once. Not to mark time, not for an event, simply to say, "We remember." And then silence again. Not empty, but full, like a blanket still warm from someone else's touch. Ailith's thought. That night, Ailith wrote in her winter journal, "The bell no longer tells me what time it is, but the silence tells me how time feels. And sometimes that's more useful."
Not every ending is a closing. Some are simply a resting place, a long exhale in the snow. Elderwin had known winters before, but none quite like this. Winter's soft exit. As the season turned, the sun rose earlier, just slightly, just enough for rooster cries to find their breath again. Icicles grew tired and dropped. Streams uncurled like cats waking from sleep. The air lost its sharpness, replacing it with the smell of wet bark and promise. The firewood stack grew shorter, but no one minded. What remained? Some things endured. The well, quiet and listening, now with new wishes. The blanket, folded neatly with a new stitch of sunrise yellow. The bell, rung only once a week, then kissed by silence. The stories, still told nightly, now by Ben too. Taller now, voice steady as his father's had once been. And Ailith? She still walked each morning before the sun, her shawl heavier with patches, her smile softer with years. The visitors. Come spring, travelers passed through Elderwin again. They came tired, worn, eyes wary from the world outside. They were greeted not with fanfare, but with warm broth and a place to sit. A small girl would tell them, "If you're sad, the blanket is near the fire. If you're tired, the well is down the hill. And if you're ready to smile, Merwin has soup." Most of them stayed longer than they planned. Some never left. A letter left at the well. One morning, someone left a small piece of parchment beside the stone well. No name, no ribbon, just this. "I came here broken, but I was not asked to be anything else." And that gave me space to grow whole again. A fire that never fails. Each night, as snow faded and flowers dared bloom, the villagers still gathered around the hearth in the meeting hall, even in summer. For it wasn't only warmth they came for. It was togetherness, stories, silence, the fire. the kind that lives in voices and glances and the passing of bread. Alis would sometimes begin the night with, "Do you remember the winter the bells stopped?" And everyone would nod, even the youngest ones, as if they too had lived it. The last words. There was no grand event to close the tale. Just a soft dusk, one evening, when the fire burned low and the world felt very still. Alith, brushing a strand of hair from her face, looked around the room and said quietly, "This is what surviving looks like. Not just enduring, but weaving beauty into the quiet days after." Outside, snow no longer fell, but inside, hearts stayed warm, and Elderwin, forever wrapped in frost and flame, remained.